Morning, everybody.
Well, good morning, Skillman. I hope you've had a good week. It's good to be back with you. I have the unique distinction of having resigned from two full-time ministry positions within the space of 2 hours. I was very happily employed in my first job. I'd worked a number of years for a church, had a great family ministry and counseling center going on. We had a big young couples program going on. Everything was just rocking along great. And one day I got a call from one of my closest friends in college, and he was a preacher at another church in another city at a really great church. And he said, "Why don't you come up, interview with us? Why don't you come up and work on my staff?" And I just thought that would be terrific because I love this guy. I really admired his preaching and thought a great deal about this church. So we flew up, I interviewed with him, interviewed with the staff, everything just seemed to go real well. The eldership was a little bit reserved, but I didn't really notice much about that. They made me an offer, I accepted it, and flew back to Dallas and made plans to move to another city. Before I left, they asked me, they said, "When are you going to resign?" I said, "Well, I'm meeting with my elders next Wednesday night." They said, "Great, then we'll pick it up from there." Went on Wednesday night to the elders meeting. Incidentally, if you attend an elders meeting on Wednesday night, that's an automatic ticket to heaven because after church on Wednesday night, nobody is in their right frame of mind. But we were doing this, so we had 13 elders. Excuse me. We had 13 elders, met with them, gave my resignation. They went around the table and tried to convince me to stay, and we did the whole conversation. Got home and was there about 5 or 10 minutes and the phone was ringing. Picked up the phone and it was the chairman of the elders from the church that I was now going to be working for. And he got on the phone and he said, "Listen, we have met. We would love for you to come. However, we are going to redo the salary offer to you." And he cut the salary by a significant amount and said, "This is your offer. Take it or leave it." And I was a young father, a young family man, had a mortgage, all this other stuff, and the number he quoted me, there's just no way in the world I could make that thing work. And I said, "Well, thank you very much, but looks like we will not be coming." Hung up the phone, I turned and looked at my wife and I said, "Well, I've just resigned not from one job, from 2 jobs, we're now employed." I remember that event really, really well because the next day, I spent that day going around to 13 different elders asking for my job back. And I can remember hanging up that phone and the shock, number one, that someone would do that, knowing full well the timing, the dismay, the disbelief that later turned to anger and resentment and bitterness and a feeling of betrayal. And I thought to myself, I cannot understand this. This just does not make sense to me. And I harbored and I carried that around with me for a long, long time. I'm in the business of helping people talk about their past. I'm a marriage and family shrink, and I have people that come in my office all the time and they'll say, "This has happened in my life in the past, and I just don't know what to do with that." Or I'll have clients come in, they'll say, "This is going on right now, and I don't know how to process that. I don't know how to make meaning out of that." When I do this work with churches, a lot of the churches that I work with will share with me, they said, "We've had this go on in our past, and we just don't know what to do with that." Or I'll run into members who said, "I'm a member of this church and this happened back a while back and I don't know what to do with that." If you're in any relationship for any period of time, whether it's a marriage, whether it's a business relationship, whether it's in the church, there's going to be events that crunch us. Does that make sense? They don't feel good, they crunch. And it is important that we know what to do with the past in order to live in the present and think about the future. So this morning, I want to spend a few minutes with you talking a little bit about how do we process the past. And I want to use some of the writings and the experiences of the Apostle Paul to help us get there a little bit. So we're going to begin to go in and make some suggestions about how we do that in no particular order. Number one, I'm going to suggest to you what I call the 70,000 rule. On Mondays, I work with a big counseling practice over in Fort Worth called Restoration Counseling. And there's a psychologist there, a Christian psychologist, tremendous fellow named Jeff Weckel. And I was talking with Jeff the other day, and he does a lot of neuroscience. He looks at the human brain and the way we process things. And he was looking at me and he said, how many thoughts do you think the average human being has a day? And I had no idea. And he said, well, between 60 and 70,000 thoughts go through our minds every day. Did you know that? I didn't know that. Then he said, we've studied that thought process. And he said, how many do you think are negative and how many do you think are positive? What would you think? Half and half. More than that?
82.
Who said 80-20? You get 100 from the professor this morning. Absolutely. You can leave now. Go get your coffee and donut. 80% are negative, 20% are only positive. Isn't that amazing? And then he said, here's the real kicker. 90% of that 80% of negative stuff is repetitive. In other words, it's the same junk that I've already thought about, what? Before. My brain is spinning on old junk. Isn't that scary? But it is part and parcel of theologically what we live in. Let's put two books together for just a second. Genesis 3 is the record of the fall. Man sins, he's cast out of the garden. Revelation 1 is where we're told there will be a reinstatement of the perfect world that we have lost in John's Revelation. Another way of understanding the fall, though, is to use a different term. And the term is broken. We are broken until God brings in his redemptive kingdom, which means that we don't work just the way we were wired up to work. We're a little bit broken. My brain is broken. As a human being, I tend to look more toward the what? Toward the negative. And so part of God's redemption with me is to try and get the spin back to what? The positive, because it just doesn't naturally go that way. And that's what Paul is talking about in Philippians chapter 4, and it's our text today. Philippians 4, I'm going to begin reading in verse 4, which is the ramp-up paragraph, and the real freight comes in the second paragraph. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Yet your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Now, the next paragraph is where he delivers the freight. So listen to what he says. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if there's anything excellent or praiseworthy, what? Think about such things. In other words, he's saying to the Philippians, your brain is going to go to this old junk. And I need you to take your brain and think about some things that are noble, excellent, happy, praiseworthy, some good stuff. He's asking them to attend to different stuff. You attend to certain things, don't you? I can prove that to you. When you're hungry and you're on a trip and you're driving down the road, what do you notice? You notice every place there is to eat. There's a Taco Bell, there's a Chili's, there's a hamburger on the side of the road. You're noticing everything there is to eat. So the question becomes, how do I begin to attend to my negative mind and turn it around a little bit? Recommendation number 1 to you is, we're just down the street from the old Dr. Pepper plant. Y'all remember that? Just down here on Mockingbird. You remember the old logo for the Dr. Pepper? What was on the front of the bottle? 10, 2, and 4. And that's our recommendation to you is 3 times a day, do a brain check. What am I thinking about? Yes, you can think about what you're thinking about. And if your brain is spinning on negative stuff, Paul would say, take that and turn it to something good and positive and noteworthy and excellent. That's what we recommend. Make sense? Number 2, we're going to move through this stuff. The second thing we're going to say is, we are going to recommend that we combat ruminating. I work with my clients on this all the time. We really want to spend just a moment on this for just a second. When I was growing up in Dallas back in the 70s, we'd go to Peaches Records and Tapes to get our albums. You remember albums? Yeah. So you go get your Allman Brothers, you get your Santana, you get the Stones, whatever it was, and you'd cut the cellophane, you take the paper out, you pull out the album, you drop it on the turntable, and then you drop that needle on there, and you'd hear Santana going, oh, you come up, oh, you come up, oh, you come up, oh, you come up. And you had a scratch in your record. Remember that? I'm showing my age here. Some of you are going, I have no idea what this man is talking about. Okay. Your brain can ruminate. Your brain can get a scratch on it at an incident that has been problematic or painful to you, and your brain will stick on that thing and it'll just stay on it like a scratch on a record. Does that make sense? Yeah. So a month, a year after that event that happened with the church where they called up and they just dropped it and, and I had to not take the job, I'd be out in the backyard. So our first house had a big backyard and I had a little lawn boy mower, and I'd be mowing back and forth, and I had this dog named Caesar, a big boxer, just stupid dog, and he'd be sitting on the back porch watching me mow. And I'd start thinking about that phone call I got on that Wednesday night from that elder. And the more I thought about it, the madder I got, and the madder I got, the faster that I'd be mowing. And this dog would just be going, doing this number back and forth. I'm going to stroke out in the backyard because my brain is ruminating on that junk. And guess what? You do that too. There's things that your brain has probably stuck on that's painful, that you're scratched there, and it needs to move on. So how do we do that? What I teach my clients, and I'm going to share this with you as well, it's what Paul is saying here in Philippians 4. He's saying, think on these things. There's probably something that you're obsessed with that's really good. I had a client not long ago that was obsessed with John Deere tractors. And before we could talk about his marriage, we had to spend 10 minutes talking about 3-point hitches to get to the marriage. I've been a drummer my whole life. You give me a piece of music and you say, listen to this music and pick out the drum part, I'm gone. I can't think about anything else. What I'm going to suggest to you is, if there's a painful memory in there for you, whether it's about a relationship or the church or whatever it may be, find that thing that you just absolutely lose your mind over. And when you find yourself skipping and you're stuck in that scratch, move to your obsession. Does that make sense? That's what Paul's talking about. He's saying, I've got to get to something good. We doing okay so far? Number 3. Number 3 is, and I'm the only one that I've ever heard talk about this. I've never read it anywhere. This is all gospel by Dr. Don here, but give up the imaginary conversations. I find that the people that I work with, when they are upset about something in the past, carry on imaginary conversations in their heads about how that conversation went, or what they wish they have said, or what they thought the other person said, and they run that narrative in their head all the time, back and forth. And it's a beautiful day in Dallas, and it's gorgeous, and it's lovely, and they're running that old narrative in their head, which just makes them feel miserable. And they're losing today, and they're losing tomorrow over that false narrative. And I would do that. I would think back to that phone conversation, I would say, well, I wish I'd said this, and I wish I'd said that. And I should have done this, and I should have done that, and they should never have done this, and I'm wasting all this time over this thing. Several years later, we used to have here in Dallas, the Herald of Truth had a big family conference called Saving the American Family. And I got to be on the leadership team of that thing and plan it with a bunch of good guys out in Abilene. And we would have that down at a reunion at the Hyatt Regency. So we were having the big banquet one night, and everybody's in round tables, all dressed up nice, this, that, and the other. And one of the speakers says, we're going to take a break, and as we do, stand up and introduce yourself to everybody around you. You know, good church thing, right? So we're standing up, and I turn to the guy behind me, and he turns to me, and I introduce myself, and he introduces himself, and it was the elder from the church that had called me that night. He's sitting right behind me. And I look at him and I introduce myself. We carried on a 5-minute conversation there, and that man never knew who I was. Question: who was carrying the old junk? I was. Who was paying the price for that phone conversation? I was. I was the one that needed to do the work, not him. Does that make sense? Well, sure. I was the one with the problem. I was living in the past, and I needed to get through that old junk. So first, we say we need to give up that old negative spiral, that 70,000, 80%. Number two, we watch the record when it's scratched and get off of that stuff where we're stuck. And number three, there are times when we need to give up those old conversations in our minds and do what Paul is saying here. We put what's true, what's excellent, what's good, what's praiseworthy. We put some good stuff in there. So what do we do instead of that? We recommend, number one, we live in a positive narrative. That's what Paul's talking about here. We live in a positive narrative. I teach at Amberton University here in Dallas, and came back about 18 years ago. For about 10 years, I was academic vice president, which meant all the faculty reported to me. And it was a cool time because our first generation of faculty were leaving, and I got to hire our second generation of professors. And they were young professors coming in, and at the end of each semester, our students would fill out a student evaluation. And they'd score them 1 to 10, and then they'd write in comments. And these were gifted professors. These were marvelous teachers, and they were knocking 9.5, 9.8. They were just knocking the top out. And you'd get their evaluations, and the writing comments were just marvelous. And as their boss, I had to read all that stuff before I sent it out to them. Invariably, though, you'd have a class of 35 students, and you'd have 34 great evaluations on this new professor, and you'd have one what? One clunker. One clunker. And I'd send all that stuff out, and then we'd be at faculty meeting the next week, and invariably, that faculty member would come up and apologize for what? The clunker. They would forget 90 positive evaluations, and they would attend to the negative narrative. Isn't that human nature? And what I would have to say to him is I'd have to say, every teacher, every class, every church gets a clunker. I think they're a sign from heaven. And so it is then that what narrative are you going to listen to? If you've got your Bibles, real quickly, turn back to the book of Acts, chapter 8, and verse 3. The guy that wrote these words and said, we need to have a new mind, think on these things. The Apostle Paul, he began as Saul, and in Acts chapter 8, he's persecuting the church. He was a well-known Jewish rabbi, and he viewed the New Testament church, the followers of Christ, as his enemy. And in Acts chapter 8, verse 3 is probably the one verse, the one episode, the one sentence the Apostle Paul wishes he could delete out of his whole life. Because 8 and 3 is going to say, godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him, but Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off men and women and put them in prison. What if that was his narrative? It's the same guy writing the same things. What if he lived in that failure? What if he lived every single day beating himself up with that old narrative of, I threw followers of Christ into prison? If he did, we wouldn't have 2/3 of our New Testament. Right? It wouldn't be there. What narrative are you going to live in? Most of us have a positive narrative and a painful narrative. And we choose which one we're going to live in. I got a lady right now. She's lost her marriage. She's lost her career. She's lost her health. She was one of the top businesswomen in the city. Marvelous woman. Height of her life, peak of her career, has been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And she's fighting for her life. And they just put her on a new medication to try and keep her fine, and it's given her acne all over her face. And she doesn't want anybody to know she's struggling with this thing. But I will tell you, I meet with her regularly, and she has more positive energy and a more positive narrative and more fight and more grit and more determination than 99% of the people that I meet. And she's facing death. But she's claiming life. Does that make sense? I don't have near the problems or the past that she does. We choose our narrative. I've been with you guys for, I guess, about a month. And most of that time, like the books talked about, I'm trying to spend a lot of time listening. A lot of time listening to you all. And we'll do that as we move forward. And I hear two narratives. I hear two narratives of the Skillman Church. I hear a proud narrative. I hear a narrative of love and grace and pride and history and good things. And it's real interesting because unlike most transitions that I work, I've been in Houston and Oklahoma City and Dallas and Fort Worth. I'm all over the place. And I run into people who will say, I hear you're at Skillman, and we just wish them the best. They're in our prayers. There is such a positive, powerful, historical, good narrative for this church. And I also hear a painful narrative, a narrative that hurts. And what I'm going to ask of you is to consider over the next few weeks moving from that painful, older narrative back into that more positive narrative. Does that make sense? Doesn't have to occur today. But I think it's a positive and important thing to do. So what do we do with the past? 3 choices. Number 1, I can choose to live in it. I could choose to have lived with that old junk, that old firing stew in my mind about what that church did, and just been miserable. Number 2, instead of living it, I can choose to loop. I can live in it or I can loop. What does that mean? Folks that loop do the past over and over and over again. In other words, they make the same mistakes over and over and over again. Most of the clients that I work with are going to be doing the same thing over and over again, and they don't break that loop. They don't change that thing. And as a result, they re-traumatize themselves. Churches do that over and over again. Most of the churches that I work with make the same mistakes over and over and over again. They don't learn from that and shift over into something new. Or number 3, I learn from it. I learned that here's something that I went through, here's something that I experienced. Yes, it was unpleasant or painful, but coming out of that, there's some learning for me. Does that make sense? And I thought, David, I thought by this point I would have it learned, and I'm still learning. Isn't that amazing? I mean, I thought I'd have it down. I have all these degrees, I have all these experiences, that and the other, and every week I'm still getting slapped around and learning new stuff. I jokingly say I take the short bus to life. So we learn. And put on my therapist hat for half a second. Some of us, we do what we call we're enmeshed with the past. We just hang on to it, we just grab hold of it and we enmesh with it. Some of us do the opposite. We disengage from anything related to the past. We run away from it. We put distance from it. We get it as far away and go, I don't want to think about it, I don't want to face it, don't let it, leave me alone. That's as old as the teachings of Christ. Christ told the story of the prodigal son. The younger boy gets his stuff and runs away. The prodigal son takes his money and goes and ends up in the pigsty. He disengages. The elder brother stays home, but is he happy or miserable? He's absolutely miserable. Absolutely. He's enmeshed. Both of them, they had their work to do, right? They both needed to move to adulthood. They both needed to confront the issue, confront who they were, to deal with the past and move forward. And we're the same way. Getting all wrapped up in the pain doesn't work, and just running away from it and going someplace else, we carry it with us. David read you that beautiful story. Debbie sent me that book, The Rabbit Listens. Gosh, what a great story. It's on my coffee table. I'm reading it to all my therapists that are in training right now. But it's the idea that says listening heals. And that's right. It really does. Next Sunday, we're going to have some focus groups here. And it's very, very simple. A lady that works with me, Dr. Sarah Blakeney, will be here with me, and we're going to have meeting times throughout the day. And if you would like to come and be a part of that, what we're going to do is basically ask you to bring one story from your life, maybe related to Skillman, either currently or in the past, that has been a crunch for you. Not the whole narrative, not the whole backlog, just one story that you're ready to lay down. You're ready to take the needle off the record and put that aside. We're going to meet. We'll give you a few minutes to share that story, so bring it in kind of synopsis form. Those of you that are big talkers, we're going to have to keep you on a schedule. But bring that story in and we're going to help you process on through that thing. You may say, I don't need that. I think that's a waste of time. This is not something I want to be a part of at all. That's cool. That's cool. We're not going to be checking off names, and everything there is confidential, and I'm not going to be sharing it with anybody. But if you've been carrying around that burden and you need to lay something down, we're going to be here. We're going to take it real seriously, and we're going to do like that rabbit did in Debbie's story. We're just going to listen. Because we think that's what the good Lord did. And that's how we move toward healing. End of the story. A little while later, I learned why I got that call that Wednesday night that said, we're cutting your salary, and I said, I won't take that job. That eldership was in purge mode. They fired my closest friend, and they fired his whole staff. And if I'd gone there, I would have gotten caught up in a purge. A short time after that, that eldership, those 13 guys that I went around to that next day and asked for my job back, came to me and said, we've just had a major problem in this church, and we need you to step in and try and get us through this thing. And I did my first transition. So what I'm saying to you is a very hard lesson. And that is, sometimes the things that are most painful for us are the things that move us to the very place we need to be. But we can't see it yet. But the good Lord does. Amen?
You are not hidden. There's never been a moment you were forgotten. You are not hopeless. Though you have been broken, your innocence stolen, I hear